All right, well, I'll just dive on in. Appreciate everybody joining this evening. And we're going to talk a little bit about native warm season grasses and how they can fit into a forage program. Give you a few little pieces of background information that'll hopefully be useful as you think about this tool that's in your toolbox. So maybe a great place to start is thinking about, well, what's the point of having these grasses? What can they do for you? And I've made a little list there of several things that I think are important when I talk to producers through the years and go out on farms and think about how we can put together a forage program. And what I want to do is talk briefly about each one of these, not going to spend long on any of them. But I think the real point is that if we think about native warm season grasses, they're kind of like a tool in your toolbox. It may be a tool we're not real familiar with, maybe a tool we haven't used much or at all. But what I want to do is help you understand how that tool can be used and maybe what it can do to help you. So let me walk through each one of these points right here about what these grasses could potentially do on your farm. So every one of us has been in that pasture, maybe not that specific pasture, but we have been in a dried up fescue pasture in the middle of a bad drought. And the same day I took that picture, just about an hour later, I was at this workshop. And that is the difference between, on your left, tall fescue, which is a cool season grass, and these native warm season grasses we're talking about there on the right. And the important thing to remember here is that tall fescue really likes it to be in the low 70s with light, steady rain. Kind of think Oregon, right? Well, these native grasses there on the right are perfectly happy at 95 degrees and can get by on very little moisture. They have higher water use efficiency than our cool season grasses. And what that means, just in real simple terms, is that for every inch of rain that falls, they produce about 2 times more forage, maybe even a little bit better than that, 3 times more forage than what these cool season grasses produce. So when we get into the hot dog days of summer, those warm season, that's why we call them warm season grasses, have an advantage because of that higher water use efficiency and that heat tolerance. Again, the difference between 70 a couple and 90 a whole lot. But that's not the only reason these native warm season grasses can help us through a drought. The other big reason is these great big root systems that are kind of legendary with these native prairie grasses. And you can see how deep they can be and how much volume of root mass they can put down. And so that helps them take advantage of water that a lot of, for instance, our cool season grasses, most of their roots are right up in here. And so that warm season grass is down here grabbing moisture that isn't available to a lot of our other grasses. And even though my list of benefits of native warm season grasses didn't include soil health, if we look at these big old root systems, one of the things we need to recognize is about everything we talk about when we talk about soil health has something to do with a root. So organic matter, ability of moisture to follow these root channels down into the soil, so water infiltration, soil aggregation, the exudates that come out of the roots that feed the microbes. So our whole underground ecosystem is being driven by live roots. And this picture here on the right is, of course, from the Dust Bowl. And that really shows you the impact a lot of roots can have on soil health. When I look at that picture, I'm always amazed to think that all this soil over tens of thousands, even millions of acres, blew all the way to Washington, D.C. That's pretty amazing. And so that's a testament to the benefit those roots have to soil health. And again, we talk about soil health so much these days, I felt like that was worth mentioning. So we got a drought tolerant grass. It can put up with heat, it can put up with dry weather, and it's got these great big roots that can access some moisture that's not really that readily available to most other grasses. Now, I expect many of you all have seen a curve similar to this before. This is just our growth curves that we show for our different forage species. The blue line in this case, of course, is a cool season grass, and we see we get a lot of growth in the spring. We get our summer slump and a little surge of growth there in the fall. Well, the warm season grasses give us that great big hump in the summer, so they make a very nice complement to the cool season grasses. And so that hump in the summer allows us to continue grazing and increase the number of grazing days we have. And by the way, the other benefit to having all that warm season grass in the summer is that cool season grass forage can rest a little bit and maintain its vigor and its strength and not get stressed out and weakened. So one of the benefits of a strong, vigorous, cool season grass stand that can also help us extend our grazing season is stockpiling. And of course, we've talked about stockpiling for years, but it's a great way to use some of our hot fescue. After we get into after a frost, we don't have nearly the problem with the ergovaline. And if we look at this just from a business standpoint, a colleague of ours out in Missouri put together this summary. And if you look at the cost of stockpiling versus hay feeding, we're cutting our cost to maintain a cow during the winter season about in half with stockpiling. So that's a second way, besides providing lots of summer forage, that kind of ripple effect of allowing our cool season grasses to work for us harder in the fall and winter. And a third way to think about extending our grazing seasons is the fact that these native warm season grasses, because they're native, we can put them on some pretty marginal sites. So here's a site here that's growing some seedling switchgrass, and you can see all the wet weather sedges in here. And so we know this is a real wet site. And what I can tell you is that producer, this is out in Middle Tennessee, you about had to have your muck boots on to walk through there before the middle of June. And he was not getting much forage out of it. This is the same field once that switchgrass was established, and you can see it's producing a huge amount of forage, and he's able to graze that for most of the summer with a whole large proportion of his cow herd. So that's a way that he has extended grazing seasons. But it's not just this wet natured ground. Here's a strip bench in eastern Kentucky. This is a reclaimed coal mine, and that stuff that's under that grass there could scarcely be called soil. It's rocks and dirt, and probably more rocks than dirt. And yet we're growing some blue stem and Indian grass up there, native warm season grasses that are providing excellent forage. And so you can take some of the sorriest sites you've got on your farm, whether it's wet natured, thin, dry, bony ground, and you can still produce some very good forage on it, where maybe in the past, with less well-adapted species, you weren't able to take advantage of that ground. So that's a third way that we can extend our grazing seasons. So we've got these grasses then that give us good drought protection and extend our grazing seasons. It's also important to notice that they are very productive on decent ground. We're not talking about great ground where you ought to be growing grain, but on decent pasture ground, they can produce very well. The blue bars you see here are from a study done up in Kentucky. It was a 7-year long variety trial with quite a few different cultivars of each one of these native grasses. And what I did is I just took the average across all the cultivars and threw those in there. The orange bars is Go Vols. That was our shorter 4-year variety trial, where we looked at a number of cultivars of each of those two species, following basically the same protocols they used in Kentucky. And what you can see for all 4 of these native grass species at both locations is these grasses pretty consistently, on average, there's up years and down years, but on average, will hit somewhere between 4 and 5 tons per acre. Now, when Kentucky was doing their trial on the natives, they also happened to have a Kentucky 31 trial going on the same piece of property and managed by the same caretaker. And what we saw with that Kentucky 31 is it produced about 3 tons. So the natives are about 1.5 tons or 50% higher than the Kentucky 31. But some of y'all may be old enough to remember old Paul Harvey and the rest of the story. So an important detail here that you need to notice is that with the natives, we use 60 units of nitrogen per year at spring green up, so late April, whereas with the tall fescue, they used 180 units of nitrogen to generate that 3 tons. So it doesn't take a lot of imagination to see that if we drop that to 60 units of nitrogen, that yield would probably be back down closer to 2, maybe 2.5 tons, but in other words, only about half of what the natives produce. And of course, our cost per ton produced, because all that nitrogen, and especially nowadays with our prices up so high, north of $1 a pound, last time I checked, that's going to be a pretty poor date right there. And so we can grow a lot of these drought tolerant grasses that extend our grazing season. But a pretty fair question at this point is, well, is the quality any good? Are these things worth a darn for animals? Well, a lot of times I run into folks who have the impression that these native grasses really aren't high quality. And I kind of wonder why they think that. And my suspicion is that maybe because of conservation plantings, water quality, wildlife cover, they've seen stuff that looks like this. And if you think that's poor quality forage, you know what? You're right. It's very poor quality forage. That's stems, y'all. This is what native grasses ought to look like when they're being grazed. And I promise you that right there is very high quality forage. Those steers right there are gaining close to 3 pounds a day in the spring of the year when that picture was taken in mid-June. But if you look across a bunch of our studies and other studies around the country, what we see on these growing classes of animals are some very good rates of gain, whether it be heifers or steers. Just by way of comparison, these same classes of animals on hot fescue, on average, are going to do about half of what switchgrass does and almost as low as a third of what this does. So in other words, about 0.8 pounds a day. So not only do we produce a lot of summer forage, but the forage has very good quality when you manage it correctly. If you let it get like that, no, you're going to get punished. But again, that's not how we manage any forage. We don't need to be seeing seed heads out there. Now, another benefit of these grasses is they're non-toxic. And we have known for decades, literally, since really the 80s, that there's a problem. In fact, even before that, it was known in the 50s that there was something funny going on with our Kentucky 31 fescue. And through the years, we've documented that it has a negative impact on a number of important aspects of cattle production. And I like this picture because, we've all seen these cattle in the ponds in the summer, and what we've learned through the years is that's because they're heated up. They have a fever because of the fescue toxin, and they're trying to cool off. But, if you look closely at that picture, most of the cattle in this little pasture are in a pond. And when I first took the picture, I was focused on that pond, but look under that tiny shade tree and that little old patch of shade there. And look, cattle are hunkering down in that tiny patch of shade. And I see one animal that's not in the shade or in the water. And I expect that poor animal's heading to one or the other. Let me show you something that I think looks better. I don't know if you agree, but that looks like grass. And I promise you it's summertime. But what if I told you, because it's true, that I took that picture at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, dead middle of summer, July 18th. I went back and checked with the National Weather Service data. It was 90 degrees Fahrenheit that afternoon, and the heat index was north of 100. What are these animals doing? They're out there grazing. Life is good. These animals, not so much. So with these non-toxic native forages, we get to dodge the bullet. And again, as that picture kind of shows you, we can produce some groceries in the summertime and run a bunch of cattle on them. Well, finally, and I don't know if Chris is still on, but I know he's trained in ag economics. And so let's talk some dollars and cents. This is from a study we did a few years ago right here in Tennessee, and we compared these 5 summer forage options. This is an improved Bermuda, and this is a warm season annual, to these 3 natives just to see what we could learn about them. And this is our net return per acre. And what we saw is the natives showed up pretty darn well. That they had good net returns per acre. A comment about the warm season annual. This particular warm season annual was planted every summer. And so the reason that net return is so low is that we have to pay for that seed, that diesel, that tractor depreciation, the fertilizers, everything that goes into establishment again and again every single summer. Whereas for these other 4 species, we don't have to do that. It's a one and done. Now, you might ask yourself, well, why did they do so well? Well, I've kind of already given you several hints. One of them is that we produce a lot of forage with these, so they have a high carrying capacity, lots of animals out there, number one. And number 2, those animals are gaining at a pretty good clip. So in other words, I'm producing more pounds of beef per acre to spread my cost out over the cost of producing the pasture. So that alone is good news. But the other part of this equation is that these pastures here are cheaper than these other kinds. I've already pointed out that with the warm season annual, we're planting every year, which we're not doing there. So there's our advantage. But relative to Bermuda grass, these are not as hungry for fertilizer and other inputs. So that's the other half of the equation, is that we can grow these cheaply. And I think it's worth a word of explanation what I mean by that. And by the way, these ag economists, when we do these calculations right here, they make us include in our analysis the cost of establishment. And folks, these grasses are not cheap to establish, but this economic analysis takes that into account, and with all 5 of these species, that's prorated over a 10-year horizon. And so these grasses right here, that expensive establishment is still reflected in here, and yet they're still more profitable. And I don't know if y'all recognize our friend here, but I bet most of y'all can grow it on your farms. Good old sage grass, broom sedge. And the reason these grasses have lower input requirements is like broom sedge, which by the way is a native warm season grass, they can get by with essentially no P amendments, no K amendments, and very, very low pHs. In other words, the same kind of conditions that broom sedge thrives in. And so with the exception of nitrogen, which they do respond to, we can save a lot of money on those other inputs. And that's part of why these grasses are cost effective. And of course, this list of benefits, drought tolerance, high yield, good quality forage, non-toxic summer forage is what we're after. And we want any forage to be cost effective, and certainly a summer forage option. So those are some of the reasons why, or how I should say, really native grasses can benefit you on your farm. So that may lead you to the question of, okay, well, that sounds like a pretty good deal, but how do I get them on my farm? So I want to take a little bit of time and talk about establishment of these grasses. And if you've heard that native grasses are difficult to establish, that's a fair statement. They're challenging. They're not impossible. And what I hope to explain to you is you can get there from here. So let me walk you through a few basic things about establishing natives. First of all, there's some things about their basic biology, seed size, germination period, seedling vigor, and their growth strategy, trying to grow their deep, deep root systems that I've already shown you before they worry about growing up, that make them very vulnerable to weed pressure. And so when we want to plant these grasses, we've got to really be on our game for competition control. And by the way, this point I just made is just as true for almost any perennial forage grass you will ever establish, and really annual forage grasses. It's just that with natives, they can be a little less forgiving. So these principles apply to any forage grass. We do need good weed control regardless of what you're planting. So really basic agronomy is what we're talking about. And right now, here we are in mid-July. This is really the perfect time to be planning for a 2023 planting project. So some of these warm season perennials that are out there scattered around in our pastures, cool season perennials, these are things that need to be controlled late this summer and on into this fall. And so waiting till next spring and hoping you get lucky on controlling these things is not a good way to plan to succeed. And let me make the point too, we're not talking about going into high quality sods and destroying sods to plant these natives. We're talking about very degraded pastures, new ground maybe that's been in row crops, or ground that is very marginal, like the examples I've already showed you. But even on these kind of scenarios, we'll often get patches of any or all of this in there. And those things are going to give you a run for your money if you don't do something about them. And again, the fall before you plant is the real time to take care of that. And knowing that we're interested in reducing weed pressure tells us that when we think about planting, crop history, site history is really important. So I've already mentioned stuff that's been in row crops where some weed pressure has been reduced, new ground where you have very little weed pressure. An example of a really tough place to plant, of course, is your sacrifice lot where you've been feeding hay every winter. You know you're going to be up against it there. So think about that as you go into it. There's nothing says you can't plant into a sacrifice lot. It's just that you have to understand you're going to have a bigger battle with weeds, and you may have to go through an extra year of competition control before you get around to actually planting. But the real point here is deal with the competition and do so ahead of time. Can you plant no-till? Absolutely. But again, what we're after is a real high quality seed bed. So one that's clean, fine, and firm. And I don't know how well it comes through on your screen, but you can make out just a little bit of green weeds out there. We want to be relentless in this competition control. So we're coming back over there. And this is a post-planting treatment right here. But we want to clean that stuff up because it's already got a head start over our slow emerging seedlings of the natives. And just a word of caution that I keep running into this problem, these dang boomless sprayers, Again, even if you're trying to plant alfalfa, seeded Bermuda grass, crabgrass, whatever you're trying to plant, that's a problem. We need a good, clean seed bed. What about a conventional seed bed? Absolutely. But folks, this on the left is not a grass seed bed, much less a native grass seed bed, right? So we don't want to plant any kind of grass there. This is what we're after, particularly for natives. Again, clean, fine, and firm. You can see some tractor tire marks in there. That, you know, they're making an impression that's not a half-inch deep. That is an outstanding conventional seed bed, and that's what we're after there. Someplace you could plant alfalfa, or as one fella joked with me, you could plant lettuce, right? So again, high quality seed beds. Excuse me. Now, just because we have done our advanced weed control and got high quality seed bed doesn't mean that we're done fighting weeds, right? So after we've planted, we have to be prepared to deal with the weeds that will come on during that first growing season. And so we often have fits with annual grasses, and there's a product on the market, a Mazapic, that can be used pre-emergence that'll help suppress a lot of this crabgrass. But even if you haven't done that, you need to be prepared to deal with that flush of annual grasses. And we can get broadleaf weed problems like you see here. And of course, in this particular case, we're able to clip that canopy and get some sunlight to these seedlings. We also are able, during the seedling year, when the seedlings get a little bit of size on them, up to that 4-leaf stage, we can use herbicides. And that can be really important in situations like this. You can see this stand rowing up already. It's about a 5-6 week old stand, but we've got this big explosion of this low growing broadleaf weed that a rotary mower is not going to help you with. And that's the kind of scenario where we have to get the sprayer out and take the chance that we might damage some seedlings to suppress that weed population. But regardless of the particular scenario, the important thing is that these native grass seedlings, and you see a small one there next to my pocket knife, they need sunlight to be able to grow and develop. And so you've got to keep the weed canopy down to allow these to prosper during that seedling year. Now, I mentioned we can spray during the seedling year, and I'm not really trying to get into these herbicides in any great detail. I just want to make you aware that you have options. That's really the point here. And so I've mentioned this Mazapic, which is sold as plateau or panoramic, but we don't want to use it on switchgrass or gamma grass, however. 2,4-D can be used, Cimarron Plus, which in fescue country, we're not real familiar with it, but it's certainly used in Bermuda grass country, and it's something we can use on these natives. What we need to be careful about during the seedling year is these aminopyrrolid products like Grazing Next and Duracor, and stuff with triclopyr in it, like Pasture Guard. And so we need to have some very well-established seedlings before we use the chemicals in this last group here. But again, the main point is you've got options during that seedling year if you need to use herbicides. Now, there's one other issue that we can't control, right? So we can do our weed control, we can do our follow-up competition control, we can do a good job of our basic agronomy. But the one thing none of us can control except the good Lord himself is the rainfall. Now, as the slide says there, both these were planted in mid-April. This is lower middle Tennessee, and this is just across the line in Georgia. And I went back on June 7th, 7 weeks in. You can see this is where we've been getting rain, is doing real well. This right here didn't get a drop of rain, and of course, you're not seeing seedlings. At the 16-week mark, we see a trophy stand of natives going gangbusters. Again, good moisture, everything was done properly. Over here, this wound up being a D5 drought, never rained all summer, not a drop of rain. And guess what? We didn't get a stand. But again, it doesn't matter what you're planting, it doesn't have to be native grasses. We need rain if we're going to be successful. So that's the part of the equation that we can't control. The good Lord can, we can't. But you need to pay attention to that, and if possible, be in a position to time your planting right in front of rain if you see some in the forecast. Now, I've mentioned these high quality seed beds, and I've mentioned the fact that these are small seeded species. Part of the reason we need the high quality seed bed, you can see this example here, these are tiny seeds. Those are switchgrass seeds, 300,000 to the pound, give or take. We cannot be burying these things. We need them to be planted very shallow. And when that drill's gone through, we ought to be able to see a little bit of seed here and there on the soil surface. There's a couple more there. Here's some big blue stem seeds. You can barely make them out, but this is almost perfect situation here because you can see they're kind of covered with that fine dust from that dry soil. What we want to do is have that rain finish planting these, just barely cover them and make sure we have that good seed soil contact. So between drought and flood and deep seeding, we often, and poor competition control, that's where we see our issues with successful native grass establishment. And so really, again, this is almost like any other grass you'll ever plant. Those same principles apply, particularly for perennial grasses. So let's talk about timing. When can you plant these? Well, these seed will germinate pretty rapidly starting above 65 degrees Fahrenheit, certainly going into the 70s and 80s all the faster. And that typically for us is late April in the Mid-South when we see those 65-degree temperatures. But we have had very good success planting in the dormant season, and I won't take time to get into all the whys and wherefores. And we've actually had pretty good luck planting even up to almost this time of year, maybe a little earlier in July. But as long as you're in a rainfall pattern where you got good soil moisture and the rains are coming, you can, if I put it this way, if I had a seed bed, a high quality seed bed and a drill parked in the shed and a sack of seed, I would plant today as long as I saw that we were in a good rainfall pattern. So here's the point. You've got about a 6-month window nearly, certainly 5-month window where you can plant these native grasses successfully. So don't get run around by a calendar or worry about a date. Instead, focus on this high quality seed bed, the good competition control, and trying to pay attention to plant in front of a rain. And our experience has been that we get very, very high success rates when we do these things. Let me jump back to this late planting. So this is that same seed bed, conventional seed bed I showed you a few slides ago. It wound up, not on purpose, but because of a very, very dry spring through June, the planting was delayed until July 5th. Bad idea? I don't know. Ask that guy right there. I think he's pretty pleased with that stand of grass. So long story short is pay attention to your seed bed quality and your competition control, and the rest will take care of itself. So I mentioned that, again, if we pay attention to these principles, which are really basic agronomy, our experience is we get really high success rates in establishing native grasses. And I kind of liken this to shooting at a small target and a big target. Annuals, Roundup ready material, you can make a lot of mistakes. Something like soybeans or corn that could be planted up, 1/2 inch into the ground up to 3 inches in the ground. Again, pretty forgiving. Natives with their small seed and slow germination, it's like shooting at a smaller target. We can do it. We just have to pay more attention. And the important point here is 12 months after you plant, you should be able to graze these stands or begin hay production. Sometimes I hear people saying it takes more than 2 years to establish a stand. I hear people try to tell me it takes 5 years. Be honest with you, if you do the things properly and the good Lord sends his rain, you are going to get a very good stand in the 2nd year that you can graze. All right, last subject I want to touch on, we've talked about how these grasses can contribute to a forage program, some of the things this tool in the toolbox can do. And we've talked about how you can get it there, paying attention to good agronomy. The last thing I want to talk about is, let's say you do have it there and you have some weed issues. How do you deal with it? Well, let's start off with the basics here. Grazing management is the #1 key. And just like I talked about with planting side of things, weed control is no different with these grasses than any other forage grass out there. The more vigorous your stand of grass, the less problems you're going to have with weeds. So where we start our weed control program is with our grazing management and not abusing the stand. The other thing that's important with natives, if you'll recall, I've mentioned how they're kind of like broom sedge and don't really need a lot of fertilizer. And if you think about that, how do we talk about getting rid of broom sedge? Well, we raise the pH and we increase the fertility so other grasses can compete better. Well, we can use that same principle in reverse and keep in mind that I don't care if the pH is 5.0 and the P and the K are very low, I can still grow native grasses very effectively. So we don't want to over fertilize. We're going to encourage something besides native grasses. And we want to make sure our timing is good when the native grasses are actively growing and they can take up the fertilizer rather than the competition. Put another way, avoid the temptation to fertilize native grasses at the same time as you're used to fertilizing your tall fescue, because that'll get you in trouble. But if you do get in a situation where you need good weed control, the same tools that are available to you are for other grasses are available to you for natives. And one thing I want to encourage you to think about is the timing and intensity of your grazing can be a pretty darn good weed control tool. Burning, we talk a lot about that with natives. I'll mention that again in just a minute. A rotary mower, and of course herbicides, which I've already mentioned, but we'll mention again. So let's go back to this canopy height thing. I'm going to ask my little buddy, the cowboy, here to help us out for a second. I often tell people that the right way to manage native grass canopies is to make sure you always keep the forages above your boot. Don't graze them down below about 12 to 15 inches. I know that sounds high, but remember, they're tall growing grasses, and we don't really want to let them get above our hip. So just to keep this super simple, if you can keep it between the top of your boot and your hip, about 15 to 30 inches, you will never go wrong, and you will maintain good, strong stands, and you'll keep weed pressure to a minimum. Show you a little data set from NC State. This happens to be with switchgrass, but they had some switchgrass that they maintained the canopy at 21 inches, 16 inches, and 10 inches. And you can see what happened to weed pressure. It went from basically nothing to 35% on up to north of 60%. Bottom line is, vigorous grass suppresses weeds, right? Very basic. And this is as true for natives as it is any other forage grass out there. Now, burning I mentioned, and again, we're not really used to thinking about burning with our fescue pastures. And I point out that burning is not necessary to manage native grass pastures, but we do need, or we can use this tool if we want to. And the key to burning native grass pastures is in the spring of the year, typically about the end of March, early April, you'll see these little shoots starting to break dormancy. And that's a real good sign that it is now time to burn. Because what that's telling you is that that native grass is getting ready to get up and run. And so if we can knock the competition and the mess out of the way in front of that period where it wants to run, you're going to wind up with these clean, vigorous, productive pastures. And so fire can be a very good tool for managing native grasses and suppressing weeds within native grass stands. Now, I'm going to revisit the herbicide issue. And again, the point here isn't to get into rates and timing and all the details of herbicide use and herbicide stewardship. But what I do want you to see is there's a pretty good little list of things that we can use, many of them very familiar to you, right? 2,4-D, Pasture Guard, Crossbow, Grazing Next, Duracor. I've mentioned the Plateau and the Panoramic, but there's a number of things that we can use here on our native grasses effectively to control weeds. And there's a few things that we don't think of using on fescue, like Pastora, which we use on Bermuda, or the Plateau and the Panoramic. So we got, and the Cimarron Plus, I guess, would be another one that falls in that category. But we've got a number of tools here, all of which can be very, very effective if used properly. So if you need to, absolutely don't hesitate to use these herbicides to control these weed problems. Now, I've been over a number of things, but obviously can't cover every idea and everything I'd like to share with you and all the questions. So I do want to point you to this web page. And there's a few resources on this web page that hopefully you'll find useful. One, at that particular link right there, is our Native Grass College, which has 3 different courses on it, one on establishment, one on grazing management, and one on competition control. And so you can go use that resource to learn about any of those subjects. We've got a large number of extension publications and scientific publications. This particular one here is one we put together with University of Georgia and Auburn University, but it's about as comprehensive a publication as there is on establishing native grasses in our part of the world. And just last fall, we came out with this Native Grass Forages book, about 450 pages long, everything you ever wanted to know about managing native grass forages. And again, it's available at the web page, $25 plus tax. In this day and age, I'd like to think that that's a steal. But main thing is that there are resources out there that you can go to that can be useful in answering a lot of different questions you have about native grasses and how they can be used in a forage program. And so with that, I'm going to end. There's a little story behind this slide. The bad drought in 2012, we got a grant from USDA to mess around with some summer forages. That slide I showed you about the economics came out of that same grant. We're comparing summer forage options. And we worked with our colleagues out in Arkansas, and they planted 3 different demo farms, and that's one of them right there. And the 8 specialists out there, some of y'all may know Dr. John Jennings, wonderful guy, really competent forage guy. He was kind of tired of hearing people say, well, these grasses are real hard to establish and they take forever to grow. So on these 3 demo farms, he went out and followed good basic agronomy and got blessed with good rainfall. But all 3 of his demo farms planted in April, by August looked like that. So maybe the message there is you can do this at home. So with that, I think, Chris, I've left ourselves a little bit of time for questions, and I'd be glad to try to answer any.
All right, Dr. Kaiser. Well, we appreciate that. We appreciate that information. I do want to add that I do know that NRCS Soil Conservation will help with some cost share, help offset that cost. I know in Van Buren County, we've got several producers that have taken advantage of that program, and we've got some pretty good looking native stands on some places.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So,
yep.
I know, Dr. Kaiser, you've come down and worked with us. And like I said, when I started, Dr. Kaiser, we're blessed to have him at the University of Tennessee. He's the native grass guru is what I call him. So.
Well, glad to be able to help. And yeah, those cost share programs are worth looking at, because I think, when I talk to people about, well, why don't we use more native grasses and why are people reluctant? And I think it really comes down to that whole establishment cycle. It intimidates people, and it's very understandable. It takes a year, and it takes money, and it takes time, and there's risk. But when you have someone stand beside you and give you a cost share check, that sure does help.
Oh yeah, and you was talking about the weed control. I know on their cost share program, you have to spray that. You have to spray that field. They want you to spray it twice. Once in the fall, and then follow up with a spraying in the spring.
Absolutely, that's a real good approach. Absolutely, the one and done will get you in trouble, going in, spraying it, thinking you're ready to roll like you could maybe with some Roundup Ready material, but you really do need to do that more than once.
But it's a good tool in the toolbox if a person wants to add it to their forage program. Does anybody have any questions for Dr. Kaiser? You can either unmute yourself and ask, or you can put it in the chat. Either one, he'll take them either way. Or if you think of one later, you can reach out to your extension agent, and we'll reach out to Dr. Kaiser, because we probably won't know the answer.
Hi, we are new to the area and just getting ourselves established. We're used to doing things out on the West Coast. What was the name of that cost share website? Program?
I don't really know the website, but each county has got a NRCS Soil Conservation office, and you can reach out to them. Or if you'll reach out to your extension agent, they'll put you in contact with that person.
Okay, and about what is the cost on the seeds for the native grasses?
Yeah, so the switchgrass is going to be the cheapest, and that's about last time I priced it, you're going to be out about $70 per acre, maybe $80 in seed cost. The big blue stem Indian grass, you're going to probably be out $150 per acre, and the gamma grass, I haven't priced that recently, but that could easily run into 250 dollars per acre for the seed. So it's going to be the most expensive one to establish. And I will point out that even though those prices might knock you over, remember that we don't need a lot of the lime and fertilizer to get started. So we're saving a lot of money there. So our real cost for these is going to come in the way of that seed. And of course, the competition control exercise that you're doing, which is really more time than it is money, but it's certainly some money as well.
Thank you. I don't have any other questions. I just want to say thank you guys for putting this on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you bet. You bet. Glad you're able to join.
Thank you. Anybody else have any questions?
Hey, Chris, how hard is it to get to grow on the hillsides?
Dr. Kaiser, you want to answer that one?
Well, it's not hard to get
The
to
guy
on the
that
hill.
asked that is, the guy that asked that is from Van Buren County. So, you know, we know about hillsides here in Van Buren County.
Well, it's not hard to get to grow on a hillside. The question is, can you do the competition control work on the hillside? Can you spray it? You know, if we're talking about a pretty darn steep hill where you don't want to put a tractor, no, I'm not going to try and plant it there. If it's not so much of a hill that you can't put a tractor on it, then I think you can get it going there because you're going to be able to spray or do the other cultural work you need to do. So it's according to how steep it is.
We've got some established in Van Buren County. Mr. Bob on some, I mean, I would call them slopes. I mean, you can get a tractor on them, but they're pretty nice slopes.
Yeah. Pucker you up slopes.
You know, water don't stand where I'm at.
It's steadily moving now.
It's flowing downhill, that's for sure.
It's a
That's true.
fact.
I'm sitting here discussing this with my father-in-law about our new property that we've acquired. As far as prepping the soil, we've already got a field full of all kinds of funky weeds, I'm sure. As far as prep work to clear it of that, do you recommend spraying, then tilling, and then letting it rest for a season before planting?
Well, a lot of it come down to what those weeds are and how rank they are. You're going to have to do one of two things. You're going to have to do some repetitive tillage on the one hand or some spraying on the other. Spraying can be really effective, but a little bit of it depends on what's out there and how rough the site is too. You know, if you've got a lot of stobs out there from sweet gums as big as your thumb, you may want to do that tillage just to kind of smooth the field up. But I would kind of let the conditions dictate. And that would be an example where, you know, if you can get your county agent out there to take a look at it with you, or maybe somebody from NRCS, I think that would help a lot to kind of come up with a plan specific to that field. I don't know, Chris, if you want to throw anything else on top of that, but I think it's going to be field by field.
Yeah, my advice is to get your agent, your county agent, reach out to them or reach out to your local NRCS person. That's normally what we do.
All right, thank you.
We draw up a plan specific for the field that we're talking about, because each field is different, each situation is different. Anybody got anything else? Scott, you or Keith got anything?
No, it was great. Always, Dr. Kaiser. We appreciate your time and just a wealth of information.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it and glad to be able to share that with you. And I guess my main thought for the folks that have joined is hopefully you've been introduced to a tool that maybe you didn't know that much about, but at least you have some idea what's involved in using it, maybe what it can and can't do for you, and how best to use it on your farm. And at least as a start, you know, certainly one presentation is not going to give you everything you need to know, but if you get with your agent or look at that website, hopefully get the other information that you'd like to have and be able to take advantage of this tool.
Again, Dr. Kaiser, we appreciate you joining us. As always, we record these, so they will be uploaded first to the UT Extension Smith County YouTube page. But if anybody would like to have a copy, if you'll just reach out to me or your extension agent, we'll get you a copy. We're doing one of these a month, so the next one will be August the 9th. And it will be at 7 o'clock. And I think the topic on August the 9th is renovating fescue fields. We put the native one here because we feel like native grasses need they need some planning before you run out there and start drilling seed. So we got Dr. Kaiser on board in July, so that way you can kind of get with the people, and plus there's a cost share opportunity if you'll reach out to your local soil conservation and our CS office. And with that, if there's no other questions, we Dr. Kaiser, we appreciate you. Hope to get you down in Van Buren County to look at some of these native stands that we've got going on.
Fantastic. Well, again, thank y'all, and hope everybody enjoyed it, learned a little something, and we'll look forward to next time around.